Canute is one of the more famous kings of England, and he's remembered primarily for two things: for being an effective king and for a story about his attempt to stop the tide from coming in, both of which we'll explore later in this video. We don't know where and when Canute was born. It's highly likely, however, that he was born in or around 990 in Scandinavia. At the time, his father, Sweyn Forkbeard, was king of Norway and Denmark, a position he'd effectively stolen after overthrowing and exiling his predecessor, his own father. During Canute's lifetime, Sweyn would launch an all-out attack on England, chase the English King AEthelred into exile, and have himself crowned King of England. After Sweyn died, Canute himself would seek to become the next English king, but would be chased out of England. Canute returned in 1016 and was crowned King of England. He ruled for 19 years until his death in 1035, probably in his mid-40s. Let's take a look at where Canute lies in our timeline. Here he is, becoming King of England just over 1,000 years ago, 50 years before the Norman invasion. Very little is known about Canute's early life. As the second son of Sweyn Forkbeard, he was a Norwegian prince, and he would have remained a simple prince of Norway and Denmark had it not been for his father's exploits in England. When he was a young boy, Canute's aunt was murdered during the St. Brice's Day massacre in England in 1002. Canute's father, Sweyn, was behind a series of Viking raids on England around then, possibly partly in revenge for his sister's death. Finally, in 1013, Sweyn conquered England, and on Christmas Day that year was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. Sweyn ruled for 5 weeks before dying. His eldest son Harold became Harold II, the King of Denmark, while Canute was proclaimed King of England by people in the north of England. The only problem with that was the English nobility in the south didn't see it that way. Instead, they recalled their exiled king, Ethelred, who returned and was re-crowned as their ruler. Canute didn't roll over and simply accept that, and so he tried to force his claim, but he was driven from England in the spring of 1014. Back in Denmark, Canute is thought to have tried to convince his older brother Harold, the newly crowned King of Norway, to help him invade England, but it seems Harold wasn't interested. This didn't stop Canute, who spent the following year building an invasion fleet. Finally, in the summer of 1015, he launched his attack. It's thought with an army of around 10,000 troops sailing in 200 longships. This army would spend the next 14 months fighting a series of head-to-head battles with the English forces, led primarily by King Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside. You might expect, given Ethelred and his son Edmund were English kings descended from the House of Wessex, that both could have relied on the loyalty of the English nobility. However, things proved to be more complicated than that. One of the first things Canute did was battle his way towards Wessex, which submitted to him at the end of 1015. Soon after this, even Mercia abandoned Ethelred and Edmund. Incredibly, Mercian forces didn't just submit to Canute. Perhaps detecting a change in the wind, they actually joined forces with him. Moving into 1016, Canute turned his attention to Warwickshire and East Mercia. Attempts by King Ethelred to oppose these advances came to nothing, and he was forced to return to London. At this point, in early 1016, Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside took the initiative and went north to link up with the Earl of Northumbria. The two armies then attacked western Mercia. In the interim, though, Canute moved his forces into Northumbria, forcing the Earl there to return home, where he was killed by a rival. On the 23rd of April 1016, the king, Ethelred the Unready, died in London, and his son, tough as boots Edmund Ironside, was crowned the next King of England. At this point, Canute's only hope of achieving his goal of becoming king was to overthrow King Edmund. To that end, he turned his attentions south and laid siege to London. Though Edmund drove Canute's forces away, he suffered heavy losses and had to withdraw to Wessex. Canute laid siege to London again, but failed and withdrew to Kent. As 1016 progressed, the two clashed again in Essex. With autumn and winter approaching, the two leaders perhaps sensed that they were reaching a stalemate and decided to sue for peace. Edmund and Canute met to negotiate peace terms, and under those terms, England north of the Thames would be Canute's, while anything south would be Edmund's. And so at this point, England has two kings, one in the north and one in the south. Only this didn't last long. Edmund died within weeks of this settlement. It's thought he was either murdered or he died of the wounds he'd suffered during battle. Finally, all of England accepted Canute as king. The first thing he did as king was to consolidate his power by executing and banishing any English nobleman who could potentially offer opposition. To that end, Ethelred's son Edwig was killed, and Edmund Ironside's infant sons Edward and Edmund were spirited out of the country. In what seems like a strange thing to do from our perspective, but which was perfectly normal then, Canute then married the widow of King Ethelred, Emma of Normandy, probably helping to legitimise his rule. He then levied around £80,000 in taxes, a fortune in that era, paid off his army and sent most of them home to Scandinavia. As insurance, he retained a smaller standing army in England. Canute allowed the existing system, whereby individual aldermen controlled England's shires, to continue, although he assumed personal control over Wessex. Canute would retain control over Wessex right the way up until the 1030s, after which he helped establish an earldom under Godwin, one of the most powerful noblemen in England at the time, and whose son Harold would decades later be the English king defeated at the hands of the Normans in 1066. One of the benefits of having a Scandinavian king on the throne was that he didn't tolerate the Viking raids that had been a feature of life in England in previous decades. In the absence of costly Viking raids, England's prosperity grew, and this is probably one of the main reasons Canute is described so favourably by contemporary records. That and his benign treatment of the church, the keepers of historical records then. He's known as a wise king, perhaps in contrast to his predecessor, Ethelred the Unready. At this point, it's worth mentioning the apocryphal story of Canute trying and failing to boss the sea around. Now, this story is first recorded more than 100 years after Canute was on the throne, so it's quite possible it simply never happened. The story goes that Canute stood on a beach and ordered the tide not to wash over his feet. Of course, the tide ignored Canute and washed over his feet anyway. The idea was thought to be that Canute was showing his fawning courtiers the limits of his kingly power. In this way, Canute was showing his courtiers that, even though he was the divinely appointed king, he was not omnipotent. Bizarrely, though, the story is often misused in the modern world to describe someone's arrogance, the idea from this perspective being that Canute genuinely thought he could order the sea to obey him. It seems highly unlikely that Canute, with his reputation as a clever military planner, commander and a wise king, would have ever thought he had the power to turn the tide. It's far more likely that those who use it to describe someone's arrogance, modern-day journalists and judges alike, have simply misunderstood the story. Just 2 years after being crowned king, Canute's older brother Harold II, the King of Denmark, died. Canute travelled to Denmark, was crowned Danish king there, and appointed a regent to rule in his place, so that he could return to England. In the succeeding years, there were challenges to his rule, but these were all subdued. Affairs in England and Denmark had reached such a peaceable state by the mid-1020s that in 1027 Canute was able to travel to Rome to witness the accession of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. Travelling to Rome as a king carried with it a huge amount of prestige, and this seems to have been reflected by the fact that Canute was invited to stand alongside the emperor during his imperial procession. In 1028, Canute set off for the Norwegian city of Trondheim with a fleet of 50 ships, defeated the king there, and was crowned King of Norway. Canute died in November 1035, and he was buried in Winchester. He was succeeded as King of England by his son Harold Harefoot, who you can learn more about in our next video. Please remember to hit the subscribe button below to receive an alert when we upload our next video. You can also support us via Patreon using the link below.